In the final days of December 1793, an American Army column pushed north through the snow of western Ohio, searching for a place none of them had ever seen. They found it without a map. They found it by the bones. Scattered across a low rise above a frozen creek lay the remains of an entire American army. The skulls and skeletons of hundreds of soldiers, lying where they had fallen 2 years earlier, in a battle most Americans alive today have never heard of. On this ground, on a single November morning in 1791, the United States Army suffered the worst defeat in its entire history at the hands of native nations. Not Little Bighorn. Little Bighorn was not close. More than 600 soldiers were killed in about 3 hours, over twice the dead of Custer's last stand. Counting the civilians who followed the army, the dead numbered closer to 900. By some counts, roughly a quarter of the entire United States Army was destroyed in a single morning. And buried inside the story is a detail that has never been explained. 6 hours before the attack, an American patrol stumbled into the enemy in the darkness and carried a warning back into the sleeping camp. The warning reached the Army's second in command. It never reached the general. The man who stopped it died the next morning and took his reasons with him. Today we're examining the survivors' accounts, the records of the first congressional investigation in American history, and the memory of the nations who won, to answer 2 questions. How was an American army annihilated in 3 hours? And how did a country manage to forget it? To understand how an American army came to die on that rise, we have to begin not with soldiers, but with a debt. In 1791, George Washington had been president for barely 2 years, and the country he governed was close to broke. The revolution had been won on borrowed money, and the new republic owed staggering sums it had no obvious way to repay. But it did have one asset: land. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains lay the Northwest Territory, the Ohio country, millions of acres of forest, river, and prairie. Congress had already begun converting it into cash, surveying it on paper, selling it to land companies and speculators, and promising it to the settlers pouring across the mountains to claim it. There was one problem with the arrangement. The land was not empty, and it was not America's to sell. It was the homeland of the Miami, the Shawnee, the Lenape, and their allies. Nations who had lived on it for generations, whose towns and cornfields stood along its rivers, and who had watched deeds being drawn up for ground they had never surrendered. In 1790, the first American attempt to break their resistance ended badly. An expedition under General Josiah Harmar marched into the Ohio country and was beaten twice, losing nearly 200 men before limping home. Washington wanted the second attempt to be decisive. He gave the command to Arthur St. Clair, Revolutionary War veteran, governor of the Northwest Territory, a man of genuine standing and genuine courage. He was also in his mid-50s and so crippled by gout that on bad days he could barely sit a horse. Tradition holds that when Washington sent him west, he gave one warning above all the others: beware of a surprise. The story of that parting comes to us secondhand, written down long afterward, but the events of this documentary are the reason anyone bothered to write it down at all. Because the army St. Clair was handed was in trouble long before it ever saw an enemy. The contract to feed and equip the expedition had gone to William Dewar, a former Treasury insider turned speculator, a man far more interested in the money than the army. What reached the troops under his contract was a scandal in slow motion: spoiled flour, condemned meat, tents that let in the rain, pack saddles built for horses the army didn't have, and gunpowder the artillerymen would later swear was bad. Remember Dewar's name. This story is not finished with him. The soldiers themselves were mostly 6-month levies, men recruited cheaply, handed a musket, and given hardly any training, stiffened by a thin core of regulars. The pay came late, the food came rotten, the desertions never stopped. Through October, this army crawled north from Fort Washington on the site of modern Cincinnati, hacking its own road through the forest and building supply posts as it went. Fort Hamilton, then Fort Jefferson. It made a few miles a day. It shrank at every mile, and it was marching straight into the start of winter. Then, on the last day of October, the campaign produced its single most fateful decision, and it had nothing to do with the enemy. Around 60 militiamen deserted in a body and word spread that they meant to plunder the Army's own supply convoys coming up the road behind it. St. Clair responded by sending his best troops, the 1st Regiment, the most experienced regulars he had, back down the road to stop them. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that recover forgotten history through original records, survivors' accounts, and the memory of both sides, consider subscribing. It helps the channel and allows me to keep researching stories like this one, because that order stripped the Army of its finest soldiers at the worst possible moment. 2 days before the battle, the best men in the Army marched away from it. They would miss the entire thing. While St. Clair's army was coming apart on the road, the army waiting for it was doing the opposite. The nations of the Ohio country had not met the American advance as scattered bands. They had formed a confederacy: Miami, Shawnee, Lenape, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Ojibwe, Wyandot, and more, bound together in defense of the land the United States was selling out from under them. This was a coalition with a command, a strategy, and a victory already behind it. It was the same alliance that had beaten Harmar the year before. Its most remembered commander was Little Turtle of the Miami, Michikinakwa, a war leader whose grasp of ground, timing, and enemy psychology would soon place him among the most effective battlefield commanders in North American history. Beside him stood Blue Jacket of the Shawnee and Buckingahelas of the Lenape, each bringing hundreds of warriors to the fires. Together, they could put more than 1,000 fighting men into the field. And behind them stood something else. At Detroit, a post the British had never given up after the Revolution, agents of the Empire quietly supplied the Confederacy with muskets, powder, and blankets. Britain would not fire a shot itself. It simply armed the men who would. For weeks, while St. Clair's column crawled north, the Confederacy studied it. Scouts shadowed the army through the trees, counting its tents, counting its cook fires, watching its deserters walk away down the road. By the start of November, the Confederacy's leaders knew the true condition of the American army better than the American government did, and they had already decided exactly how they would fight it. There would be no mass charge into American volleys. The warriors would fight from cover, from behind every log and every tree, and they would form a great half moon around the enemy and close it like a hand. Above all, their fire would be aimed from the first minute at just 2 targets: the officers and the gunners. Kill the men who give the orders, silence the cannon, and it would not matter how many soldiers were left standing inside the circle. They would be a crowd, not an army. On the 3rd of November, St. Clair gave them their moment. His force, now down to about 920 soldiers, trailed by some 200 wives, children, laundresses, and settlers, camped for the night on a low rise above a narrow, ice-fringed creek. St. Clair believed the stream was a branch of the St. Mary's River. It was not. It was the headwaters of the Wabash. No entrenchments were dug that evening. The ground was to be fortified in the morning, and the militia, the least reliable men in the army, were posted by themselves on the far side of the creek, a few hundred yards out in front of everyone else. The night came down cold with the first snow of the season, and through that darkness, silent and unseen, more than 1,000 warriors were already moving, spreading into a great crescent around the sleeping camp. The mystery at the center of this story begins around midnight. Out beyond the lines, an American patrol was moving through the woods. Captain Jacob Slough and a few dozen volunteers had slipped out that evening, hoping to ambush the raiders who kept stealing the army's horses. Instead, they found something far worse. Passing through the trees in the dark were large bodies of warriors. Not a raiding party, but formations. Group after group, all drifting with purpose in the same direction, toward the camp. Slough understood immediately what he was looking at. He pulled his men back, got them inside the lines alive, and carried his report straight to the second-in-command of the army, Major General Richard Butler. Butler listened. He thanked Slough for the information. He told him to go and get some rest, and then he did nothing. He did not strengthen the picket lines. He did not order the army to stand to arms before dawn, and he did not walk the short distance to the commanding general's tent to wake Arthur St. Clair, the man who had been warned above all things to beware of a surprise. Why? More than 2 centuries later, the honest answer is that nobody knows. The record offers only fragments. Butler and St. Clair had feuded through the whole campaign and were barely on speaking terms. The army was exhausted, and weeks of sniping and night alarms may have taught its officers to shrug at one more report of movement in the trees. Perhaps Butler meant to act at first light. Perhaps he simply did not believe it. Every explanation is a guess, because Richard Butler had about 9 hours left to live, and he spent none of them explaining himself. The general slept. The army slept. Just after first light on the 4th of November, the drums beat, the men stood morning parade, and were then dismissed to their breakfast fires. The one moment in a military day when an army is neither asleep nor standing to arms. Muskets stacked, hands full, backs half turned. The Confederacy's scouts had watched this routine for weeks. The attack began the instant the men reached the fires. The woods on three sides opened at once. The first blow fell on the militia across the creek, and they lasted less than a minute. They fired a ragged scatter of shots, broke and ran, splashing back over the icy stream and into the main camp in a screaming mob, with the warriors so close behind that the two sides came entangled together. The fugitives smashed through the first line of levees like a wave through a fence, and before the army had properly formed, the enemy was already inside its edges. Then the crescent closed. From behind every log and tree on three sides came aimed, deliberate fire, and it went exactly where it had been planned to go. The artillery crews died first. The gunners on the rise were shot down around their pieces almost to a man, and the cannon that were supposed to be the backbone of the army fell silent one by one before being swarmed and taken. The officers went next. Marked out by their uniforms, they were picked off with terrible patience, until whole battalions stood leaderless inside the smoke. Hundreds of armed men with no one left alive to tell them what to do. In the middle of it moved Arthur St. Clair. Too swollen with gout to mount unaided, he had one horse after another killed as men tried to lift him into the saddle, until he gave up and walked the line on foot. His coat and hat shot through, the man inside somehow untouched. Whatever his failures as a planner, no one who survived that morning ever called him a coward. Richard Butler, the man who had received the midnight warning, was shot down early and mortally wounded. His men carried him to a tree and set him against it, and he went on directing the fight as his life ran out. He died on the field. Whatever his reasons for the silence of the night before, they died with him. Again and again, the Americans did the only thing left to them. They fixed bayonets and charged, and the charges worked for a moment. The warriors ahead of each charge melted back into the trees, slid around its flanks, and sealed the ring again behind it. Every attack bought a few minutes and cost more officers. The circle never broke. And in the crowded center of the camp were the people the histories too often skip. Some 200 wives, children, and laundresses had followed the army north, and they were now trapped inside a shrinking ring with nowhere at all to go. When the fighting reached the wagons, it did not spare them. By the end of the morning, nearly all of them had been killed or captured. It is the hardest part of this story, and it belongs in any honest telling of it. After roughly 3 hours, St. Clair faced the arithmetic. To stand was to die to the last man. He ordered a breakout. One final bayonet charge tore a gap in the ring, and through that gap the survivors ran, abandoning the wounded, the cannon, the tents, the dead, everything. For 29 miles, the road back to Fort Jefferson was strewn with everything an army can throw away: muskets, cartridge boxes, coats. St. Clair's own report, written to the Secretary of War 5 days later, refused to dress up what that retreat had been. He used one word for it: a flight. Then came the counting, and the numbers still read like a misprint. Of roughly 920 soldiers in the camp, about 630 were killed, and some 260 more wounded. That is a casualty rate of about 97 in every 100 men engaged, and it swallowed nearly the entire officer corps. Add the camp followers, and the dead of that single morning approach, 900. Now set that beside the battle every American knows. At the Little Bighorn in 1876, Custer's command lost around 270 men. The Wabash killed more than twice that number of soldiers, close to 3 times as many counting the followers. And by most estimates, the Confederacy's own losses came to a few dozen. No defeat of the United States Army by native nations has ever come close. In 3 hours on ground, most Americans could not find on a map. Roughly a quarter of the nation's army had ceased to exist. In December, one of the surviving officers rode into Philadelphia carrying the dispatches. And what the president did next created a power American presidents still use today. The officer was Major Ebenezer Denny, who had lived through the whole of it and who reached the Capitol in mid-December carrying news almost too large to deliver. What happened when that news reached George Washington has become one of the most famous scenes of his presidency. And here, the record demands honesty. The vivid version of the scene was set down decades later, secondhand, by other hands. It does not come from Washington's own pen. But as it was remembered, the president read the dispatches, held his composure through dinner, and then broke, pacing the room in a fury, raging that his army had been butchered by surprise, the one disaster he had specifically warned against, and calling St. Clair, in the most quoted phrase of the account, worse than a murderer. Whether those exact words were ever spoken, no one can prove. What Washington verifiably did next is a matter of record. When St. Clair came to Philadelphia demanding a court-martial to clear his name, Washington refused to grant one and asked instead for his resignation from the army. He got it, but the disaster had already set something much larger in motion. The House of Representatives voted to investigate what had gone wrong. The first congressional investigation of the executive branch in the history of the United States. And when the committee demanded the War Department's papers, Washington gathered his cabinet around a table to weigh a question no one had ever faced before. Must a president hand over everything Congress asks for? Or may he withhold what the public good requires? In the end, the papers were handed over, but the principle had been spoken aloud for the first time. The first faint articulation of what Americans now call executive privilege. It was born not in a courtroom and not in a crisis of state, but in the wreckage of an army on the Wabash. The committee's findings pointed away from the battlefield and toward the ledgers. The blame, it concluded, lay chiefly with the War Department's delays and with the contractors, the rotten food, the failed equipment, the bad powder. Which brings this story back to William Dewar. Dewar was never punished for what his contracts did to St. Clair's army. He did not need Congress to ruin him. He managed it himself. Within months of the battle, his private speculations collapsed, helping to trigger the first financial panic in American history, and he was thrown into debtor's prison, where 7 years later he died. The man whose spoiled flour and bad powder helped kill an army finished his life owing money. St. Clair fared little better. He was never formally cleared. He held the governorship of the territory for another decade, lost it, and died in poverty in 1818. And to this day, the most common name for the battle is simply St. Clair's defeat. His name, welded permanently to the worst morning of his life. Washington drew one hard lesson from all of it. He would not build a cheap army twice. Congress authorized a new professional force, the Legion of the United States, and its command went to Anthony Wayne, a revolutionary veteran with a reputation for fury and a mind that left nothing to chance. For nearly 2 years, Wayne drilled his legion without mercy until it could do in deep forest what St. Clair's men never could: stand, maneuver, and hold. And in the last days of December 1793, Wayne sent a column north through the snow, back to the Wabash. This is where our story began. The soldiers found the battlefield by its bones. Hundreds of skulls and skeletons lay scattered across the rise and along the creek, exactly where the army had fallen 2 years earlier. Before the men could pitch their tents, they first had to clear the ground of the dead. And the burial parties passed down one detail above every other. Many of the fallen, they reported, lay with their mouths filled with earth. The message was understood then exactly as it is understood now. You wanted the land. On that ground, over those graves, the Legion raised a fort and gave it a name that was both a promise and an admission: Fort Recovery. Several of St. Clair's lost cannon were found where the victors had hidden them, dug out of the earth, and mounted on the walls of the new fort. Then came the symmetry that closes this story. In the summer of 1794, the Confederacy attacked Fort Recovery. striking the exact ground of its greatest victory, and this time was thrown back. Weeks later, on the 20th of August, Wayne's Legion met the Confederacy at a place called Fallen Timbers and broke it in about an hour. The surviving warriors fell back to the British fort on the Maumee and found its gates barred against them. The empire that had armed them for years would not risk a single shot to save them. Little Turtle had seen it coming. He had studied Anthony Wayne the way he had once studied St. Clair. And in the councils before the battle, he argued for peace, warning that this American commander was not like the others, that this one could not be caught sleeping. He was overruled, and leadership of the fight passed to other hands. He was right. The next summer, at the Treaty of Greenville, the Confederacy ceded most of what is now Ohio. And when the surveyors drew the new boundary of the United States, they ran the line through Fort Recovery itself. The border of the nation was drawn across the battlefield. Little Turtle spent the rest of his life at peace with the country he had once outgeneraled. He traveled east, met President Washington face to face, and received a sword from the president's own hand. When he died in 1812, he was buried with full military honors by officers of the army he had annihilated on the Wabash. Which brings us to the strangest fact of all. The worst defeat in the history of the United States Army at the hands of native nations, deadlier by far than Little Bighorn, lives today in almost no popular memory. No great painting hangs in any gallery. No national park preserves the field. There is not even an agreed-upon name. Americans have called it St. Clair's Defeat or the Battle of the Wabash, every version built around the men who lost. A leading modern historian of the frontier gave his account of the battle a title that says everything: The Victory with No Name. Little Bighorn got a monument, a legend, and a place in every school book. The Wabash got a quiet obelisk in a small Ohio town, raised in 1913 over the reburied bones. Part of the reason is the shape of the story. Custer's disaster came wrapped in a last stand, doomed, defiant, easy to mourn, and easy to mythologize. The Wabash offers no such comfort. An army surprised at breakfast, a general who could not mount his horse, a panicked flight down a forest road. There is no gallant final image to paint, but there is a harder reason underneath it. The Wabash was, above everything, a native victory, the greatest ever won against the United States. Little Turtle and his allies outscouted, outplanned, and outfought an American army on its chosen ground and destroyed it almost to the last company. For a long time, that was simply not a story the country wanted to tell about itself. So for the better part of 2 centuries, it mostly didn't. What remains is quiet, a warning that stopped 1 tent short of the general. An army that died at its breakfast fires, a presidential power still in use, born from the inquest, and a victory so complete that the only names history kept for it belonged to the losers. Perhaps that is the real lesson of the 4th of November, 1791. Nations do not only forget by accident. Sometimes forgetting is a choice, made quietly, 1 generation at a time, until even the ground gives up its claim on memory. The Wabash never asked to be remembered, but it has waited under a small town in Ohio for anyone willing to look. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed documentaries that recover forgotten history through original records, survivors' accounts, and the memory of both sides, consider subscribing for more investigations like this. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Was the Wabash forgotten because it had no heroic last stand, or because the wrong side won too completely? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.